orange come down?
Yeah, I was wondering what the hell that
It
was.
was a prayer.
Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. For today's program, I'm happy to be joined by Jerry Harris. The two of us will be talking about the global crisis and in the context of the current political and economic situation, particularly in the U.S. I'll go first and speak for less time, I hope, than Jerry. He's got much more to say than I do. Jerry Harris is the General Secretary of the Global Studies Association and has been very active in discussions of globalization and of transnational capitalist class. I'm at the Center for Global Justice, where I was one of the founders and have been organizing these webinars along with help from a committee here at the center, and have for years been leading trips to Cuba. Cuba is very much in the news today, and there will be a webinar in 2 weeks on Cuba that will be of interest to many of you. But let me start off on today's topic on global crises. Converging crises on a global scale beset us today. Economic crises, a climate crisis, a political crisis, social crises, and a pandemic on top of it all. A quick historical excursion will help put this in perspective. The Roosevelt administration set the U.S. on the course to remake the post-war world, putting it on the path to capitalism. The late Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin showed in their masterful study, The Making of Global Capitalism, how they built the state capacities needed for the U.S. to lead this historical project. I maintain that what much of the ensuing Cold War was about was preventing the former colonized countries of the global South from fashioning their own national alternatives to the capitalist model. For its part, the U.S. maintained a national economy based on the social welfare capitalism fashioned in the New Deal. While this golden age of capitalism created a prosperous middle-class society, by the 1970s, this model reached a point of exhaustion. No longer able to find sufficient places for affordable investment in the domestic economy, and unable to continue to support rising standards of living for its working class, capital looked abroad for places to continue its quest for endless global accumulation. Thus ensued a new stage in the evolution of capitalism, the age of neoliberal globalization. With the aid of a state long accustomed to serving the interests of capital, corporations moved their production from the high-wage unionized industries of the US to the low-wage disorganized workforces of the global South. The result was the deindustrialization of the US, deconstructing the industrial working class in the home of capitalism and reconstituting it in the global South. Today, that is where 80% of the world's industrial working class is located. This has had unexpected political consequences we can now see clearly. In a webinar last November, I spoke about the crisis of liberal democracy. There is a crisis of legitimacy as trust in political elites and even liberal political institutions themselves has eroded. I argued that this was due to the loss of faith in the American dream that had promised rising standards of living and given the liberal political system stability. As large swaths of the population experienced economic stagnation or even downward mobility resulting from neoliberal globalization, further exacerbated by the financial collapse of 2007 and 8, they no longer believed the political system could deliver the goods. It was this status insecurity and their precarity that led to the surprising election of the anti-establishment Donald Trump in 2016. This signaled a collapse of hegemony. The polarizing Trump administration resulted in the largest voter turnout in 120 years, as over 150 million people went to the polls in 2020 in hopes that just maybe voting can make a difference. Did this signal a restored faith in liberal democracy? Many liberals breathed a sigh of relief that the institutions of democracy had survived 4 years under an authoritarian president. But today, 8 months later, that optimism is less certain. Trump defiantly asserts that his loss was fraudulent, a claim believed by maybe 1/3 of the electorate who had long ago lost all faith in the political system. They constitute a mass base for authoritarianism. This radicalized cult is now overhauling the electoral machinery at the state and local level to ensure future success for the right. Meanwhile, at the national level, the Republican politicians Trump captured aim to block the programs the Biden administration needs in order to restore some faith that the political system can work for the people. Without a restoration of some level of legitimacy, the crisis of liberal democracy will deepen. At this moment, the prospects for the future do not look bright. One thing the pandemic has made clear to many is that we need government. A collective threat like COVID calls for a collective response. The successes of other countries with strong public institutions in containing the virus is a lesson to be understood. The US public health system, highly privatized by neoliberal policies, was too weak. There's now a wide recognition that strong public programs are required, not only to ensure public health, but also for many other public goods. This is reflected in domestic policies promoted by President Biden. Once an advocate of neoliberalism, now he almost sounds like a modern-day New Dealer, advocating for social programs as part of the infrastructure needed to make society work. If successful, we are looking for a vast expansion of public goods, ranging from childcare to the internet. This could go far toward restoring legitimacy to the political system. Failure will likely push the country further to the right. While the exhaustion of neoliberalism has been laid bare, the contradictions of the globalized regime of capitalism presents new challenges to the system. The expanded accumulation it made possible now has resulted in an intensified crisis of overaccumulation, with astronomical masses of capital roaming the globe looking for profits. Militarized accumulation is one strategy for extracting value from investment in the security state surveillance apparatus, as William I. Robinson points out. Michael Hudson points to financial speculation as another strategy used by capital. Already weak consumer demand has been further weakened by the pandemic. The state is now desperately seeking to restore demand with debt-based stimulus. But at the same time, the wealth amassed by global corporations and the ultra-wealthy has grown exponentially. Some of it is being ostentatiously squandered in space adventures by two of our super wealthy. But it's hard to see where this surplus capital can go productively unless the uncreative destruction of our endless wars can somehow erase it. What makes all this all the more challenging is the catastrophic climate change we now face. The industrial system built on fossil fuels and the mass consumption it produced is now destroying the Earth's capacity to support civilization. There is an urgent need to convert to renewable energy and to draw down greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by regenerative agriculture. But the political and economic power of the existing fossil fuel industry is formidable. ExxonMobil, BP, etc., are a major part of the global economy. The value of their stock depends on the reserves they have in the ground and their ability to extract them. If they do, it is games over for humanity. We are faced with a choice between the survival of Exxon or the survival of humanity. Only nationalization of these corporations seems able to stop their plunder of the planet. But the only other time in US history such a massive taking of private property happened was when slavery was abolished, thereby erasing a form of property that had been crucial to the economy. And it took a civil war to make that possible. How could we dream of doing anything like that today with fossil fuel capitalism, especially when its global scope is beyond the reach of any state? But what is within the reach of states, with the political will to do it, is the promotion of alternative green energy sources. China is leading the move in this direction. In the US, the state is promoting electric vehicles and building the infrastructure needed to support them. Solar panels and wind turbines have also been promoted by the state as an alternative source of electricity generation, and its cost is now competitive with coal and oil. Financial capital, always risk adverse, and institutional investors, pushed by popular pressures, are becoming increasingly wary of the long-term prospects of the fossil fuel industries. But can market forces save us in time? Concerned citizens are also in motion, pushing a largely dysfunctional state forward. If we could bring the state to a serious Green New Deal that could solve the overaccumulation problem and restore legitimacy as well. But it may already be too late. Meanwhile, the engine of capitalism grinds on unrelentlessly. But remember, while I have shared the pessimism of my mind, we also need the optimism of our will. Now, let me turn the floor to Jerry Harris, who will talk about the national and transnational translate into political divisions and competition in the current global crisis in this post-neoliberal era. Take it away, Jerry.
Thank you, Cliff, and want to welcome all the comrades and folks who have come in today. I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Cliff did, mainly through a sort of a Gramscian framework of hegemonic blocks. And I really want to concentrate mostly on digging a little deeper into those blocks and sort of the moment that we're in today. But let's start out, as Cliff did, just with a little introduction to the last 40 years of neoliberal hegemony. And it has been since, really beginning with Thatcher and Reagan, introducing neoliberalism very powerfully in the West. But that also coincided very importantly with the market reforms of Deng Xiaoping in China. It happened at the same time that in Russia, we saw the establishment of a neoliberal oligarchy. And it also happened, and I'm referring here, all this is in the 1980s, at the cusp of the information communications digital revolution, which actually made financialization possible because of the speed and the connectivity that we've never had before, and establishing a command and control that capitalism never enjoyed on a global scale. And all that came together in a new hegemonic block of neoliberalism and a transnational capitalist class globally in the 80s, and has lasted until really today. I think we're just emerging out of that now, which of course will be the main aspect of what we want to talk about today. I think the break with neoliberalism, it's really been going on for quite a while. And I think it began really in 1998 with the first really serious crisis of globalization. That was the Asian crash, in which South Korea and Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and other countries had a huge financial crisis because speculative capital just fled those countries, billions of dollars just fleeing those countries within 3 or 4 days. Their economies crashed. The IMF came in just with the most strict, horrible austerity and privatization, neoliberal policies, making the working class and the poor pay off the debt. At that point, that's when you see Stiglitz and Krugman start to really criticize neoliberalism and sort of finally reject it. And actually to the point where Larry Summers purged Stiglitz out of the World Bank in his position at the World Bank. So that was the first serious break. And then, of course, the 2008 really deep global crisis was the big body blow, to neoliberalism that really shook it up. And that coincided also with Piketty's book, which really set off sort of an intellectual revolution that a lot of the progressive and sort of mainstream progressive economists started to really pick up and discuss. And so politically, after 2008, in terms of the weakening of neoliberalism, we start to see movements to the left and the right. So, of course, we see the Tea Party in the United States, which leads, of course, to the Trump victory, but we also see the rise of sort of the far right and fascist groups in Europe. But we also see the rise at the same time of the Occupy movement and Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece. And all this reflects a loss of legitimacy for neoliberalism that just kept gaining strength over this past decade. So we arrive at this moment here with the Biden election. Uh, Really, it's the culmination of 10 or 12 years of ongoing debates over the economy, over policies and policy centers and think tanks and political circles, and also a widespread abandonment of the traditional conservative and liberal parties in Europe and in the United States, and the growth of the left and the right. Right. So it's a sort of a 40-year accumulation of contradictions um, that we've seen finally sort of come to a head. So I think we are entering a post-neoliberal period. That doesn't mean neoliberalism is dead. It still has quite a lot of strength, particularly in finance capital. But things are changing, and I think that's the main aspect of the moment we're at. And so new hegemonic blocks are being put together. They're actually power blocks at this point. Nothing is hegemonic at this point. Nothing has reached a level of consensus in the majority of the ruling class, either on the left or the right. And what I think a new hegemonic bloc tries to achieve is a cultural narrative, political policy, and a form of accumulation. So I think we see all those coming together, both in the Trump authoritarian capitalism bloc and in Biden's, what is emerging around Biden, which is still really sort of undefined, but the outlines are pretty clear at this point. So let's go into the authoritarian capitalism bloc a little bit with detail, and then move on to the Biden phenomena. So I think the main danger, the main enemy for us is unquestionably authoritarian capitalism, white supremacy, uh, which encompasses actually a neo-fascist militarized wing of the movement, as we clearly saw in January 6th. Um, they control the most powerful political party in the developed world, in the Western world. The Republican Party is the most powerful political party in the Western world, continues to be so, particularly on a state to state level, and it has a voting base of 73 million people. Uh, that's a powerful enemy, and we really have to confront it and realize it and defeat it. Uh, I don't think we're going to win a lot of those people over, quite frankly. We can win some over, but mainly I think we have to defeat this authoritarian neo-fascism. Um, as Cliff mentioned, I think Bill Robinson, who's I've worked with for 20 years now, uh, has gone a long way to theorize sort of around authoritarian capitalism. So his idea, in terms of its economic basis in militarized and repressive accumulation. And he would include in that, the billions of dollars in the military budget, um, all the internment camps around refugees worldwide, not only here on our borders, but of course in Europe and in other countries. Of course, the police forces are part of militarized accumulation. And as part of that, uh, there's a technological importance to military equipment and surveillance equipment, right? So he brings in Silicon Valley and finance capital in terms of their investments in Silicon Valley and in corporations like Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, et cetera, et cetera. So he ties all this together as the financial base and the fraction of the ruling class that is supporting authoritarian capitalism and this far sort of right wing, what I would call actually nationalism. Bill still thinks it's mainly a transnational phenomenon. Um, I think there's some weaknesses in what Robinson is putting forward. It's in the main, I think, correct. I mean, obviously, it's really happening. We can see it in front of us, all that, what he talks about. But I think there's a couple caveats that we have to realize. One is that just because capitalists invest in Boeing and Raytheon and surveillance doesn't mean they're fascists. Capitalists invest in everything that is profitable. So many of them don't view putting money into McDonnell Douglas any different than they view putting money into the pharmacy industry or the logistics industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's, the 17 biggest financial institutions in the world. They control about $41 trillion worth of money. And, the militarized accumulation is part of that, but it's only one part of that. It's a much bigger global economy with massive amounts of speculations and all sorts of different parts of, the world economy. So I don't think we can assume that just because a financial institution invests in Boeing, that they're going to support a fascist project. It just doesn't follow. Some of them certainly will. For the globalists and the transnational capitalist class, they've always been sort of technocratic authoritarians, right? The World Bank, the IMF, these have been governance bodies, very powerful, that have been separated from any type of popular input for the last 30 or 40 years. So there is sort of a overlap in terms of authoritarianism here, but there's also some significant differences, which I'll want to either get more deeply into here in a few minutes. So let me turn to sort of the Biden administration and what I would call a post-neoliberal or perhaps a neo-Keynesian emerging bloc. First of all, I want us to think about it as in a much broader sense than Joe Biden. I mean, he's just, as Trump, the authoritarian capitalism, fascism is much broader than Trump. Same thing with Biden. So while many of us are focused, oh my God, what's going to happen in the elections next year and what's going to happen in the presidential elections in 3.5 years from now, very important, but that doesn't really encompass the moment. In putting together a hegemonic bloc, we're looking at what the strategy for the capitalist class, what the strategy for the ruling class is going to be, probably for the next 30 or 40 years, because that's usually about the length of what hegemonic blocs run before they peter out of speed and legitimacy. So first, I think in looking at this post-neoliberal bloc, it's very broad, with many forces that we would, of course, oppose. First of all, it's really a democratic bloc, is opposing authoritarian capitalism. There's a democratic, or we should say, bourgeois democratic bloc that opposes fascism. And that runs all the way from Cheney to all of us on this discussion today. It runs from Cheney, Marxist left. Everybody who wants to maintain freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of assembly, the right to go out on the streets, the right to vote, the expansion of civil rights, all that is within the realm of bourgeois democracy. And that's quite a large front. Within that, there's obviously a developing right, left, and center. Let's dig into that a little deeper. Um, First, well, the left is the easiest to understand because that's us, and that's Black Lives Matter and the Sunrise Movement and AOC and Sanders and DSA and various revolutionary organizations, uh, and um, uh, and I think we have a very important role to play in the coming in this period in terms of pushing and trying to solidify the most progressive aspects of the post neoliberalism. Um, but let's look at the other two center, the other two areas of who I would include in this block. First, the center and the center left. You know, the center moves left and right depending on the time. You know, I think we saw this during the Vietnam War. The center moved to an anti-war position eventually. So today, the center has moved to the center left, and that certainly includes Biden. It even includes, God forbid, Schumer and Pelosi these days. Um, and what the Biden administration has done is legitimize the left agenda. If you look at the human infrastructure bill, physical infrastructure stuff, the pro labor bill, the pro voting rights bills, the Green New Deal type of initiatives, all of that comes from the left. All that comes from Sanders and those to the left of Sanders in our opposition to neoliberalism for the last 4 damn decades. These are the things that we've been talking about and pushing for and fighting for. And the fact that Biden has put them forward in a legislative form opens the door very wide for the left and for our growing influence. Will there be compromises? Obviously, there'll be compromises and steps backward. Biden's a centrist. He can be affected and moved by the left. He can be moved by the right and the neoliberals. It's already evident. But the content of these trillions of dollars, not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars being argued over and put forward and being debated over a left, essentially in a left agenda, is really a different moment than we've been in for the last 40 years. And I think we need to recognize that. Now, these legislative initiatives, which run into thousands of pages, just didn't spring from the head of Biden like Athena coming out of the head of Zeus. I mean, there are hundreds of people in policy institutes, in think tanks, in academia, among economists who have been debating and discussing this stuff, as I've said, for over a decade now, at least since 2008. That's where all this comes from. So there's a whole center left of progressive thinking that was really pushed forward by Trump and authoritarianism, uh, pushed much closer to a left agenda. And that's what we're seeing coming out of here. So even if this stuff, we don't, it's our role as the left to push it as far as we can and to keep pushing uh, what we hope will be a hegemonic block around these ideas for the next 20, 30, or 40 years and pushing it all the way possibly to an eco-socialist transition. That would be obviously the best outcome. Um, but that's going to be a very tough fight. Um, who is the right in this block? Well, there's still a lot of neoliberals in and around the Democratic Party. And we know who a lot of them are. I mean, Bloomberg and, uh, Jamie Dimon from Morgan Stanley and Larry Summers and Fink from BlackRock and certainly the Clintons. All these people are very powerful and influential, and they're pushing for the most sort of mild reformism, right? Sort of a mildly reformed neoliberalism. And they've been talking about it themselves. I mean, they have their own networks and circles. They call it stakeholder capitalism. They call it inclusive capitalism. They make lots of speeches with crocodile tears and then go back and do what they do. So particularly people like Fink and Diamond, who are at the very elite of the transnational financial hierarchy, they've made lots of statements around the need for inclusive capitalism. But when you look at what their banks and financial institutions are doing, while they're putting some money into, green and alternative um, projects, they're still financing fossil fuel. They're still financing the military industrial complex and all that comes with it. And so if this wing of sort of the general Democratic bloc wins leadership, I think it will eventually mean actually that authoritarian capitalism will win out, because these mildly reformed neoliberals have really very little or nothing to offer the working class. And they won't be able to regain legitimacy for the system. So while our main enemy is authoritarian capitalism and white supremacy, within this bloc, certainly there's going to be a very tough battle with the neoliberals. Uh, Now, what do the neoliberals bring? Why would I even include them in a, post neoliberal or democratic bloc? Well, there's a couple of things that we have to think about. One is that they have recognized that globalization and financialization has caused a lot of class contradictions, and that needs to be stabilized and dealt with to an extent. Um, they are, and this is perhaps the most important point, building out the green means of production, right? We need today, we need yesterday to build out solar power plants, wind turbines, do the research, do the development, new batteries, new utility um, concepts, all sorts of things. And money, in fact, trillions of dollars now are being put into green accumulation. The left is not in a position to do that, right? It's not us who are doing the research and development. It's not us who are building solar plants. It's not us who are building the wind turbines, right? That's a sector of the capitalist class that's putting their money into that and building out these productive capacities, which hopefully under eco-socialism we'll be able to nationalize. But certainly we can't wait, and the planet can't wait for some distant eco-socialist revolution before we start building out these means of production. That has to go on today, and even in a much greater extent that's being done. So our job as the left is to push it and to push it and to push it. For example, one struggle that I don't think the left has even been very well. That's not true. The left, part of the left, has been engaged upon this, but right currently now, the Biden administration, with their concept of alternative energy, is pushing for large solar farms, large wind farms, and a redesigning and re-engineering of our utility lines into a national network, so we can bring wind power from Nebraska and use it in New York. Uh, but part of the more left wing of the environmental movement, of course, is pushing the idea of solar panels on houses everywhere, right? And on all public buildings, which creates a decentralized energy um, transition rather than a massive centralized capitalist owned and capitalist funded energy system uh, built around large scale utilities. That's a battle going on right now that I think that we need to be engaging in more forcefully, for example. Um, so the other thing that makes these neoliberals, and also the Biden and the Clintons and Gates and all these folks, uncomfortable with white supremacy and authoritarian capitalism, is that they're multiculturalists. They're not I wouldn't call them anti-racist. They don't have an analysis of racialized capitalism or a historically deep understanding of how deeply embedded racism and capitalism is, to the point where institutional racism will be with us as long as capitalism is with us. But I think they do truly, and in their self-conception of their moral self, believe in multiculturalism. In other words, we can have Obama as president. That's not going for these people. They're not going to fund the Tea Party. We could have Khan as mayor of London. We can have Colin Powell as Secretary of State and Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State, working for the globalists, but not for the fascists. So that level of multiculturalism is a bit of a block from them going over to the white supremacy fascist wing of the ruling class. And there's also a constitutionalism that is believed in. Um, and we see it in the military. If any of you got around to reading my article, you can see how so many of the elite in the military and in the CIA were frustrated and angered by Trump's um, attacks on the security apparatus, which is rather strange for a neo-fascist or authoritarian to do. But I mean, some of them were just outraged and spoke out in very strong terms against Trump, which is very unusual for the military hierarchy to do. But they were defending bourgeois constitutionality. Uh, rather than fascism, which is a revolutionary movement from the right. Right, it's not a conservative movement. Fascism and authoritarian capitalism is a revolutionary movement to overthrow democratic bourgeois democracy. Uh, so globalization is being challenged on the right, and neoliberalism is being challenged from the right in terms of its nationalism. And it's also being challenged from the left. So the post neoliberal period includes challenges from both sides of the political spectrum. And that's why it's in really deep crisis. Um, Even though we're entering a post neoliberal period, nothing dis totally. I mean, this idea that there's a totally sharp break in historic periods, and you wake up the next day and it's socialism and it's utopia and we're in a totally new revolutionary situation, like was thought with the Russian Revolution or the Jacobin Revolution. They renamed the calendar year one, year zero, right? I don't think dialectics works that way. The old exists in the new. So neoliberalism is going to be around and pushing, even as it has lost legitimacy. It will be an enemy to deal with for a good deal of time. So I think for the left, and I'll conclude here, we have a rather complex uh, strategy and tactical situation, because we have to figure out what type of issues and relations to have with all these forces, and how do you balance striking the main blow at the main enemy, white supremacy and neo-fascism, while also opposing neoliberals who may be putting money into green accumulation as their strategy for capitalist renewal. How do you do that? Will the center, can we unite enough with the center left to get them to reject the neoliberal right of Bill Gates and Bloomberg and Lawrence Summers? Or will they ally with them, and will the left be the ones left out in the cold? Strategy is really important at this time. And the left center strategy means defeating the right within the hegemonic bloc, within the new emerging hegemonic bloc, but also defeating authoritarian white supremacy. And that's going to be difficult. I mean, it's our organizations, while growing, we there's still a lot of thinking to do, and there's still a lot of growth to happen. But it is happening. But I just needs to happen faster and more. So let me close it off there and open it up for some debate and discussion. Thanks for listening.
Yes, there's a lot to chew on there, and I'm sure that there'll be many comments that people will want to share with Jerry, and questions. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube can get your questions and comments to us by sending them in an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will pass them on then to Jerry. Those of you in the Zoom room, of course, can put your questions and comments more directly. In fact, I will put you all on gallery view so I can see you. And everyone will turn on their camera. And if you want to say something, just wave at me. Wave at me and I'll call on you. By the way, the article that Jerry referred to is available on our website. You can go to globaljusticecenter.org, and the description of today's webinar contains a link to his article. But I want to welcome all of the friends and comrades that I see here in the Zoom room, and look forward to a lively discussion with you all. I saw David Schweikert waving his hands, so let me call on you first, David.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, those are both really good talks, and there's almost nothing I disagree with there. But there's like three elephants in the room that didn't get talked about that I think are really important. One is, I'll start with a smaller one first, which is not so small, the Koch network, the well-organized Koch network, which is its center, is it right? It's not really authoritarian. It's not really, they're worried about keeping the capitalist class in power. If that requires going to the right, okay. If it requires going more to the center, they will, but they've got an enormous block out there. They're the ones that control the Republican Party. They're the ones that invented the Tea Party. They're the ones that invented ALEC and all of that kind of stuff. So their role, I think, should really be considered in all of this. The next one is really kind of controversial on the left, and that's nuclear power. I've been studying that a lot, and I do feel that if you're looking at the science, and I was an anti-nuclear person, for many, many years, belonged to an organization in Chicago, went to meetings, and, gradually, sort of dropped off. And then I started reading some of this alternative stuff and about if you're serious about climate change, you can use renewables, but that is not going to be enough. You can't do it quickly enough, and that is possible. So I really think that's something we have to be thinking about carefully. And then, of course, the gigantic elephant in the room is China. And I've been talking about China for a long time. It's fascinating to me to see that the Monthly Review, who's long been, anti-China, has got a whole issue shifting their view. Okay, the new Cold War, and what the positive things that China holds out here. And the part of the other negatives is the center that Jerry's talking about. No, they're on board. They're going to do a lot of progressive things. They're certainly on board with the new Cold War, Blinken and so on. Build a military budget, give them more money. Why? Because, well, we got the new Cold War going on here, and very provocative. That's a way of the capitalists can unify the various segments, if I get a common enemy. And I really worry about that dimension too. And also, footnote, Deng Xiaoping was not a neoliberal. Okay. I mean, he introduced markets, as I've always argued you need under socialism, but keep control of finance, keep the state enterprises and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's an issue that is going on in China, and there's a big debate and how it's going to finally turn out. But it's not in the same league, as standard, neoliberalism. So, China, nuclear power, and the Koch networks. Those are my three. Say what you want about them.
Okay, Jerry.
Thanks, Cliff, for destroying that in my lap. But yeah.
I know you have a lot to say on China, especially.
Yeah. On the Koch network, I think they're part of the authoritarian network. I mean, because, well, just their whole agenda, of attacking any type of government activity within the economy, essentially, at least social services, etc. The anti-environmental, and actually, I talk about the Koch brothers in the paper, but I didn't mention it here. Nuclear power, I don't know enough really to have an opinion. I would, like you, David, a very anti-nuclear power for a long time. Used to lecture about it to my classes. Then I started reading what Jim Hansen, from NASA, started to argue about the necessity of it. So I just don't know at this point. To me, it's an open question rather than a closed question. I'll go that far. China, of course, is a topic by itself. In fact, I raised to Cliff, should we do a total session on China, or should we do this on, post-neoliberalism? Let me say just a few things in passing, though. First of all, I said Deng brought the markets to China. I didn't say he was neoliberal. But certainly this political consensus around the new Cold War happened very rapidly, right? And it took, I think, the Chinese off guard, and it took a lot of people off guard. I think a lot of it has to do with the political elites trying to achieve legitimacy, trying to take away some of the base of the Trump supporters. There are some real grievances and differences between the U.S. and the and the Western transnational capitalist class, and how China has approached globalization. Around governance, around a lot of things. But I will say this: I just am completing another paper, and because this fascinated me, the whole Cold War thing and where it was coming from. And I went and started to read a lot of primary sort of policy papers from transnational capitalist class spokespeople in, the Council on Foreign Affairs, the Atlantic Council, the Commission on U.S.-China Security, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty much those speaking for finance capital are against the Cold War. They talk about quite openly, about the need to make money, that the market should not be interfered with, that you're cutting back on our profits. We need to invest. Yeah, there's some differences here, but they can be worked out. Yeah, there's governance issues, but let's go to the WTO, let's go to the IMF, let's go to the G20, let's talk about this stuff. So to me, this is also presents an interesting contradiction between transnational capital and the political elites, because as Marxists, we've always sort of had this view of, well, the government always represents the major fraction of capital. And here, to me, there's a pretty clear split happening between the needs of the political elite around legitimacy and seeking stability for the system, and realizing how dangerous globalization and financialization has become in terms of austerity, in terms of the right wing, in terms of threats to bourgeois democracy and everything that they've built over the last 40 years, and to their whole philosophy of neoliberalism and kicking, Chinese companies out of the stock market of the US, although they just open up in Hong Kong, and transnational capitalist class goes over to Hong Kong and buys the same stock anyways, no big thing. They also, transnational capitalist class is invested in almost all the major Chinese state-owned enterprises. They're invested in the banks. They don't have majority ownership in any of those, but they do approach 15 to 20, 23% in some of the major Chinese transnational corporations. So it's a fascinating contradiction. I'm not sure how it's going to get played out, but it is at, I think it's going to, that tension is going to increase over the coming months and over the coming years, because I can't, at the heart of globalization, at the heart of this 40-year project is the US-China relationship. I mean, this has been constructed over 40 years, over $3 trillion of cross investments. That's a lot of money. And then we're not even talking about Japanese investments, which are even greater in China, and EU investments in China and all that. So this is a huge global circuits of accumulation. I mean, we're talking about how capitalism circulates globally every day in the trillions of dollars being disrupted politically. And so I think, I'm not sure where it's going to go, but I think the tensions and the contradictions are going to get pretty sharp around it.
Let me just add a brief note. I quite agree that China has not followed a neoliberal model. In fact, very much the opposite. State-directed development has been its orientation as an alternative to the neoliberal approach. And on the Koch brothers, as advocates of, basically, as basically libertarian in their orientation, they have promoted in the United States a kind of neoliberal approach with government regulations and the like, keeping their hands off capital, something that that Trump certainly pursued, but having given birth to a kind of grassroots right through their sponsorship, through Koch brothers' sponsorship of rightist movements, they've now created a situation where their representatives at the state level are imposing all kinds of restrictions that you would think would move in a different direction from any strict neoliberal approach or libertarian approach. But I'm sure Koch brothers are quite comfortable with that. I have yet to see, Ari Berman or others who have been so critical of the election suppression efforts explore the money behind that, and to what extent the Koch money may very well be one of those that's financing it. But I thank you, David, for your questions, and I want to welcome Carl Davidson, who had his hand raised, and let me turn the floor over to you, Carl. If you'll unmute.
There we go.
Good.
Thanks, Cliff. I'll start off by saying Jerry's main opening point about the crisis in hegemony and neoliberalism is right on target. The way I put it is neoliberalism is exhausted. especially domestically in the United States. That doesn't mean that the neoliberals aren't still around or that they don't have power. It's just that they're exhausted in being able to present any solutions to existing problems. Uh, when they do, when and if they do come up with a solution, it's usually just realized by everybody that it's a non-starter. Um, I had an interesting discussion uh, uh, the other day with my congressman. The Democratic local Young Democrats had called a mass demonstration in defense of democracy and our county seat, and he turned out to be one of the speakers. So I went up and talked to him later, and I told him that asked him whether, he got in a fight with the Republicans on January 6th on the floor that almost came to blows. And so I asked him if that experience had radicalized him at all. He laughed and he said, well, let's put it this way. It certainly brought a great deal of new clarification as to what was going on. And he completely agreed that the Republican Party had become a party of irrationalism with a fascist core. And he agreed that it had to be crushed. Not the bipartisan stuff was a bunch of nonsense. Now, this is a guy who was endorsed by the Blue Dogs. He never endorsed the Blue Dogs himself, but they embraced him. So he's gradually moving left, and he sees the necessity of major new green industrial policy. He's all for it in terms of mobilizing the forces to have a green manufacturing industrial policy, especially for our neck of the woods. So he's definitely being pulled over into our Bernie Sanders camp. He's not completely there, but he's certainly becoming an ally. So I think that's some of the dynamic that Jerry's talking about. What it means practically for us is that it really boils down to two simple points. One, defeat every Republican that you can at all levels, from dog catcher on up. And second, elect every Justice Democrat like AOC and the squad that you can. But even if you can't elect people like them, defeat every Republican with no matter what Democrat's on the ticket. That is going to be absolutely essential. And the reason why is, if you study the numbers from the last election, Trump got more votes than the Republican Party ever has gotten in any candidacy in its history. He gained a great deal over even himself in the previous round. So Trump and Trumpism is still very much alive. The luck on our part is that we gained even more, but that the difference was we're hanging by a thread. I'm working on a project to get the green manufacturing industrial policy in a bill and get it through into Biden's package, and we're right on the verge of doing that. But the problem is, I can count on the 5 fingers of my hands the margin that we have as to whether we're going to get it passed or not. It's really a cliffhanger as to whether any of this stuff is going to get through. And if we don't mobilize in a huge way and beat back all the fascist nonsense that the Republican Party is putting forward, from wanting to have our schools teach out of textbooks from the Confederate States of America when it comes to issues like slavery and so on, to the voter suppression and all the rest of it. We really have to understand that the kind of block that we have to create. We're in an alliance with Democratic neoliberals. There isn't any sense of pussyfooting around that. It's a tactical one, but it's nonetheless true. But at the same time, we have a left called a Rainbow Social Democratic bloc that we have to build up its strength in order to be able to have the clout that we need to keep Biden away from the worst aspects of an imperialist foreign policy. And I'll try to get him to do sane things like normalize relations with Cuba. But that's a much longer discussion for another day. So that's my comments the points I'd like to make. I'm basically in agreement with Jerry and Schweikert and David Schweikert too, for that matter.
Carl referred to the importance of running candidates even at the dog catcher level. And I just like to underline the importance of that. The challenge, political challenge to us is not only at the national level, but at the very much at the local level.
It's even more important at the state level, right?
And the state level.
The state level is where all this shit is. We have no national right to vote. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. We have a 15th Amendment that says you can't discriminate because of race, because of vote, but there is no national right to vote. The right to vote and all the rules regulating voting are at the state level, and that's why the Kochs are pouring tremendous amounts of money into all the states to restrict and pull back the right to vote, and that's why the battle's going on there. And if we ignore it, we're done for.
Mm-hmm. I quite agree. As we look back, for example, at the post-Reconstruction period of the latter part of the 19th century, what made it possible to put Jim Crow into place and dismantle the Reconstruction institutions was what happened at the local level and the state level, where officials in all kinds of positions were replaced by white supremacists. And it's that kind of incremental takeover of the institutions of government at all levels that we are seeing taking place now. And that's where we have to engage the battle. Jerry, did you want to comment on any of Carl's points? And then we'll move on to Mark.
No, I agree with everything Carl put forward. I would just add too, in terms of progressive changes, much of it comes from the state level. If you look at the 30s, unemployment, Social Security, they came from the mass movements at the state level, built up to national legislation. So it happens from both directions, left and right, state level stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me turn the floor over to Mark Ginsburg, who, by the way, is not at the University of Guantanamo, in spite of the sign behind him. He's at American University, right?
University of Maryland, but I'm actually in Santa Cruz at a distance, retired, but still working, as many people. My question really, I guess, is mostly for Jerry, but I'd be interested if Cliff and others would comment on this. To me, what hasn't been discussed is the issue of gender and how that is, if at all, important in distinguishing either the two major blocks or the sub-blocks that Jerry described, and what the implications are for that in terms of mobilizing people for one or the other of these blocks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it surprises us all the amount of women who have voted for Trump, with his incredible record. I think, obviously, again, abortion is, the struggle around abortion rights is still with us. And perhaps the right is in the greatest position in the Supreme Court it's been since the passing of Wade. So that may be, another huge point. I mean, obviously the women's movement was the first to erupt in terms of the anti-Trump mass opposition and the resistance, and played an incredibly important role in it. I think from a sort of a working class perspective, if you look at the urban working class today, which is much less white male industrial workers and much more Black and Latinx women workers in hospitals and in education. And so I think women, and I think we see that sort of where the woman who just won the mayorship in Buffalo comes out as an organic leader from the working class. So I think that is going to be a really important area in terms of where class and gender sort of merge together, class and race and gender. Triple oppression, which was a common concept that we used to use in the 60s, is obviously reemerging in a very powerful way.
Yeah, just looking to see if we have any questions coming in from YouTube viewers, but so far nothing there. Let me remind you, if you do want to send a question or comment, email it to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Okay, anyone else here in the Zoom room? I just want to welcome Al Campbell. I see he just turned his video on. Of course, we have Harry Targ and Melissa Young. Many familiar faces here in the Center for Global Justice. Vicky Ligon. Any of you want to? Okay, Al.
Yeah. Mostly I wanted to just throw out a question. I don't think it's a simple question with a simple answer, but just something to think about. The talks were both great, and I really agree fundamentally with everything and have been arguing that we're definitely headed towards post-neoliberalism, an exhaustion of neoliberalism. It's no longer able to do for capitalism what neoliberalism did for 40 years. Of course, it was brought in when the Keynesianism could no longer do what it did for many years too, the same sort of change. And it's very interesting. Before I just throw out the question to Jerry and maybe even to Cliff, I did want to just say a couple of things to a couple of ideas that, two things that David said. And again, just one of them is a different point of view, just to think about. I'm not going to argue them at length. The Koch brothers, I think, is very interesting. They're certainly phenomenally powerful, and they have to be considered what they're doing. I think what Cliff said about them is really important. They really push a libertarian point of view. Libertarian when used in defense of capitalism. And of course, typically they abandon their principles as all ideologues for capitalism do when it becomes convenient to do so. But I just wanted to say on the Koch brothers, it's really important from the economics field where I work that, these guys did some amazing stuff that had really huge, besides the, funding of seats of universities and, requiring that they teach capitalism and stuff like that. The pulling together of the whole Virginia school and the funding of George Mason University and the bringing together of Buchanan and Coase and Tulloch and making a whole stream of ideas that came out of that really fed into neoliberalism, that had a really far-reaching effect on neoliberalism. Now, we know that neoliberalism itself is inconsistent. It puts forward certain ideas like the government shouldn't intervene. And then, of course, it intervenes massively, not just now, but every other time that it needs to save capitalism. But anyways, that's just on Coase. That's not on Koch. I agree with David completely that the amount of money they have. They have more staff people than the Republican National Committee. It has to be looked at carefully. The thing I just wanted to throw out quickly, disagreeing on, is we should not turn back to nuclear power. We don't have to turn it off instantly. I totally agree that it's much less of a danger than continuing with fossil fuel. So there we agree. But, they've put us into this box. When I was at MIT in the Earth and Sciences department in the 70s, we did calculations then, and you could have gone entirely solar. It would have taken 30 or 40 years to do. but you could have started then and we'd have no fossil fuels right now. And it was brought up, it was argued, and it was shot down. And so, I mean, the calculations are simple. Solar energy, with all its, wind and tide and all those aspects, is enough to drive the entire energy needs of humanity vastly over. The total energy is just a couple of percent of what the sun's energy falls on the earth. And then it's not used and it's re-radiated back into space as black body radiation. And all you have to do is do work with that. I mean, it's massive. It's going to take decades to do, but in theory, there's no reason for fossil fuels. There's no reason for nuclear power, which is bad, though not as bad as fossil. I'll just throw that out. And I know that's a debated issue, and that's a separate topic itself. The question I wanted to ask for everybody to think about, for Jerry and everybody else, because I totally agree that, we have this central commitment to fight authoritarian capitalism, which is developing. And incidentally, this has been developing for a long time, because you remember in the 70s and the 80s, we started talking about the rise of the strong state. And the strong state has just morphed into authoritarian capitalism. It's the exact same trends. It's the dismantling of bourgeois capitalism as we knew it after World War II, which of course was different than capitalism before World War II itself. But the question I want to ask to consider is, it picks up with the correctness of what Jerry said, and then asks the next question, which is, why is the capitalist class turning to authoritarian capitalism? And, because one of the things we all know, have talked about for 40 years, is a weakening of the ability to self-organize of the working class. And, authoritarian capitalism, as we knew it before in the 30s in Italy and Germany, was exactly a response to the danger of the working class. That's why they turned to it. They had to. And that seems to me to be clearly not the case in this right now. Working class has continued to explode for 40 years, but that's different than its ability to self-organize in an ongoing, continual way. And so that's the question. I mean, I don't have an answer. I have some thoughts on it, but I'm not going to run on about my thoughts. I'm really more interested in what your thoughts on it, or all of us to continue thinking about, because I don't think there's any simple answers to that out there, which is, if so, I agreed, authoritarian capitalism is where they're headed, and it has to be fought. It has to be fought. Why? The starting point is always making as much possible space as possible for the working class to self-organize. That's why it has to be fought. We do better under bourgeois rights than we do under authoritarian capitalism. Absolutely. Same reason we fought against Nazism. But again, they're not adopting it for the same reason as they did Nazism. And so that's what I'm asking, why are, given the fact that the working class is not in anywhere, I mean, we wave our hands and say, oh, they're afraid because capitalism is coming apart and there's going to be an explosion. And that's why they're doing this. Maybe that's right, but it's not totally satisfying as an answer. And so there is no threat of a real left taking over in any of the advanced industrial countries anywhere. Well, England came close, but anyways, that's my question to Jerry and to Cliff, and actually to anyone else that wants to chime in on that. Why is the capitalist class turning to authoritarian capitalism?
Well, if I could just throw into that discussion the thought that one of the things that that liberal capitalism depended upon was the consensual compliance of the population. And as long as it was able to deliver the goods, there was consent to the existing economic and political system. But now it faces a legitimacy crisis. And in the face of that loss of consensual compliance, it has to resort to the only other method it has, and that is coercive compliance. And I think in that framework, one can begin to understand why this turn toward authoritarianism that is being called for not only by the masters of wealth, but also by popular classes.
Yeah,
Jerry?
I'll just make a very short comment. I see Paul Elizabeth raising his hand here too. This is a question that others have asked too, the obviously different. I think just one observation is I think there's sectors of the capitalist class that have never been comfortable with bourgeois democracy, have always seen it as external and a bother to being able just to run the system as they like. And I think we saw within sort of the technocratic authoritarianism of globalization, was very strongly sort of present there too. So that may be another element. But Paul, you were sort of waving at us. So
Yes, go ahead, Paul.
you're
Unmute yourself.
you're on mute, Paul. Paul, you're muted.
Yeah, I think that I agree with what people have been saying about the loss of consensus, but you have to look at the other end of it too, I think, to answer that question, which is where's the dissensus coming from? And well, you had the Obama presidency, a black man as president, and that was, partly the result of this rise in pressure from people of color, and in the few years just before Trump's candidacy, you had Black Lives Matter and Me Too, which had enormous cultural impact. And I think that that's what a lot of this. I mean, if you look at what the Republicans were saying as a clue, I think that that's what the rise in authoritarianism was largely in reaction to, because there's enormous instability that comes from those challenges.
Yeah, David, you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I think there's two things I want to mention here in terms of what's been said recently. But one is the notion of authoritarian capitalism. I don't know that it's exactly authoritarian capitalism that the Koch network is worried about. It's about democracy. Okay, you can have a democracy where only conservative people run for office and get elected and so on and so forth. You got to keep the democracy in chains. Okay. And another dimension of the Koch network that I've just recently sort of been starting to do some research on is, and it's tied to this, one of the big concerns. I mean, the capitalist class, the Koch network got going worrying about young people. Okay. And you're seeing that now too. And now there's a network out there. You just check out the Leadership Institute, for example, Koch funded, massive right-wing network that has two dimensions to it. One is to go after left faculty. Okay, you've got Turning Point. You've got seminars that they hold with. They try to set up libertarian parties on campuses, student groups. And then networks as to how to call out these left faculty members and so on. Particularly the non-tenured track. They used to be tenured radicals. That's not the ones they're worried about now. It's those non-tenured ones that you can get rid of, which I think, is really frightening. And the network they've got to recruit young people into this libertarian framework and so on. You get internships, you get lots of money, and so on and so forth, to carry that forward.
I'm driving.
I'm talking.
I'm driving.
Okay. So anyway, it's that the network focusing on young people. They're worried about the young people, and it's not so much authoritarianism they want as they just don't want democracy.
Al, did you want to speak to your question? No.
I'd like to add to it too on this question of democracy that David brings up. I think democracy was always a class compromise, going back to the American and French Revolution. Those revolutions were a class coalition between the rising bourgeoisie, middle class, rising middle class, but also the poor, peasants, farmers, and the working class. And out of that class alliance came citizenship and ideas of democracy that were, democracy when it first was within the American Constitution, as we all know, was for, property, white males. But also we had the Bill of Rights. We had the freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of press and the right to assemble, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all that was a compromise with the mass popular base that made those revolutions successful. And over the next 200 or so years, a good section of the capitalist class, bourgeoisie, has come to accept that compromise as the best form of rule. That it brings stability, it brings a lot of flexibility to the system where they can incorporate the demands of women, the demands of minorities, the demands of unions when necessary, but not to the extent where it threatens their power. But I think, as I said, sections of the ruling class have never been comfortable with democracy. That goes back when the whole Rockefeller tricontinent,
Yep.
what was it? Their
Trilateral,
study.
trilateral commission.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Their famous study in the 60s where there was, too much democracy, and democracy
Yep.
was the problem. So I think that that's always been in there, in sections of the ruling class and their thinking, to get rid of as much democracy as possible. It just gets in the way of what they want to do.
And to bring it back to the US history, what we saw in the 19th century was the formation of a very undemocratic system in the South, disenfranchisement of major portions of the population, and the powers that be were quite comfortable with that. What we face now is the prospect of a reinstitution of that, now not just on a regional level, but even nationwide. Yes, Harry Targ, welcome to our discussion.
Hi, I had lots of notes, and I'll skip most of it and just address the more political science question. People use as sort of one-item indicators of support for government. Question about how much do you respect the president, the legislature, professors, funeral directors, and so on. And looking at data, which is reported in the Washington Post every year, there's a radical decline in respect and support for the presidency and the Congress. When I prepared some lectures relating from the 40s, from the 60s through the 70s, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson's level of support was about 85%. After Watergate, support for the president declined to 40%. I think I saw within the last few months or so indicators of legitimacy to indicate that level of support for government is below 20%. So we are living in, as Cliff has said, a profound legitimacy crisis. Secondly, the projections are right that for sure by 2050, maybe earlier, minorities will be the majority, people of color, women, and so the very nature of the electoral base will have changed radically. And third, as I discovered maybe a year or so ago, working on a paper for the Global Studies Association, is that most polling data indicated that level of support for Green New Deal, Medicare for all, any number of issues, ending student debt, were overwhelmingly supported by masses of people. And going back to Nancy McLean and her argument about the Koch brothers, I think she suggests that a central feature of James Buchanan's theorizing is that democratic capitalism requires minority rule. And to the extent the extent majorities make decisions, they'll make decisions that violate the interests and values of the economic ruling class. And she spends some time talking about the example of Chile, which makes the story quite clear: the destruction of a democracy, the establishment of a ruthless dictatorship. And James Buchanan goes to Chile and advises Pinochet to write a constitution that will inhibit or prohibit majority vote. And today, Chileans are rising up to rewrite the Constitution so it is more democratic. So these are just some things to add to the story.
Yes, Al.
Yeah, I guess I will. I guess I will respond. No, I totally agree. There isn't clearly. I mean, Harry's figures underlined it, but your statement that there's a loss of belief in the system, which is extremely important. But again, that doesn't quite answer the question for me, and in two ways. First, historically, and then from the point of view of the internal settling of issues by the capitalist class. So historically, I mean, in the 1960s, just lots of people in the establishment were scared shitless of what was happening with the real explosion of radicalism in the United States. And yet they didn't turn to authoritarianism at that point. Now there was, as Jerry points out, there's certainly always currents, that wanted to go that way. But that's exactly my point. It's not just about currents. What my question is, why for 40 years has the capitalist class been moving towards a strong state and then an authoritarian state? This is not just now. It's not just the radicalization post-Great Recession, et cetera, et cetera. This is something which began 40 years ago. You go back to the 60s and they had Watergate. And, as you guys remember, as an anecdote, Richard Nixon called in the attorney general who was, I can't remember, but he told him that he wanted them to drop the charges against Spiro Agnew. And, just like Trump calls in people and tells them to do it. And the difference was the attorney general said, you can fire me if you want, but I'm attorney general. I don't do that. And, then we had the whole Watergate hearing, et cetera, et cetera. So they chose not to go that way. So that's the historical thing. In the face of a loss of belief in the system, they did not turn to a more authoritarian state at that point. And so why are they doing it now? But it's not even just now. It's been going on for 40 years before this present crisis. The other thing is something which Jerry said, which, I mean, that's the way we always understood it as Marxists. I hate the word Marxist because it sounds like religion, and historical materialists, because we're scientific about this thing, So that, the capitalists consider the bourgeois state a really good structure for solving their internal capitalist differences. If you allow an authoritarian state to exist, it's really easy to be captured by interests like the fossil fuel industry interests, which have captured the United States capitalism even more than they have European capitalism, and are screwing it up in the competition for the post-fossil fuel energy supply by capitalism that's going to come afterwards. So again, that's the question. Again, why are they turning to the capitalist? If, as Jerry says, and I agree, that the capitalist class as a whole, with currents that disagree, has always thought that bourgeois democracy is the best way to solve internal differences in the class. Why are they for 40 years drifting first to a strong state and now to an authoritarian state?
Carl put himself on staff, which we haven't been using, but he wants to.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I think the part of the answer to your question is that most of the bourgeoisie does not want to go to a fascist or authoritarian form of rule. Most of them are opposing it. So the question is really, why does a sector of the ruling class think that it's necessary to go to these kinds of extremes? What is it that they're concerned about? And I think exactly what they're concerned about is the loss of a white supremacist bourgeois democracy. As they see in the rise of the Democratic Party as a multicultural party that's drawing a majority towards them, including a great number of young people, that their voting bloc is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if they don't turn it around, um, they're going to be a minority party far into the future. So the way they have to do it is to turn it around. Is that they have to wage a kind of cultural political war to reinstate white supremacy, and that's why they need people like Trump. And they need not only white supremacy; they need a certain brand of it. They want a neo-Confederate Southern brand of it that includes the rebel flag, the Confederate flag, along with the U.S. flag. Their base is largely built from white evangelicals who also want to restore the patriarchy, and in that sense, also a Southern-style patriarchy, by putting women back under the thumb by repealing Roe v. Wade. And so it's by this onslaught against the advances in women's rights and the advances in democratic rights for other people of color, is that only if they don't defeat that, if they can't run that, smash that, and find institutional ways to block it from coming back, they will never be in power again, because they've shown them come to the crossroads that Bush 2 posed to them, which is, well, we have to change the nature of the Republican Party to being more inclusive of minorities, or we have to become an all-white working class party. They've chose a latter road, and so to split off part of the part of the working class that identifies as white, they have to indulge in this fascist demagogy, and they have to build basically a fascist party to do it, and they have to suppress. They're always going to be a minority. They understand that, and so in order to maintain the rule of a minority, with roots going back to John C. Calhoun, in his theory of the concurrent minority and the majority, and the rule of the importance of the rule of the minority, they're going to need an authoritarian bloc in order to do it. Otherwise, they're done.
Al? Mm-hmm.
Just real quickly, I mean, I think everything everyone's saying makes a lot of sense, and I don't have simple answers, but I keep coming back to the same thing. I mean, Carl started off by saying it's a minority in the capitalist class that wants to go this way, and I think that may be true. My recent polls haven't come in yet. I don't have quite all the data from asking the capitalists what they think, but I'll get that soon. But so I actually think that's true. But then that's the question: how can a minority of the capitalist class direct capitalist policy for 40 years towards moving away? Because for 40 years they've been moving away from bourgeois democracy. How can a minority direct them for 40 years with all these things that we're seeing? Anyway, it's something problematic when the ruling class of society isn't able over decades to act in its own perceived best interest.
Well, yes, one thing you have to remember is that what they've done consistently over the 40 years, beginning with Reagan and before then. First of all, they built up before Reagan, but with Reagan, they've used the so-called Southern strategy as the key to their rule. It's not just simply a minority rule; it's a white supremacist minority rule that they want to maintain.
I'd like to jump in here too a little bit. I see other hands going. We got a hot topic going. To me, part of the answer may be that we're looking again at two different factions of the ruling class. When we talk about the move towards authoritarianism over the last 40 years, to me, that's the transnational capitalist class, and that they had a particular technocratic authoritarianism that was based in global governance bodies like the IMF and the World Bank and the G7, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're talking about now is more nationalist faction of the ruling class based on white supremacy and the neo-Confederacy. So there's been these authoritarian tendencies on both factions, but the factions have a different sort of economic base and a different political sort of different. This, one is, as I said, transnationally based, and the other is more nationalist based. And I think that speaks to some of the differences.
Nationalist right-wing populism.
Yeah, right-wing populism. Because the transnational capitalist class is authoritarian, but they're multiculturalists too, right? So, like I said, Obama and Rice and Colin Powell can be part of their fit very comfortably into their, the best and the brightest, no matter what color, as long as you're serving global capitalism. But that's not what the neo-Confederacy, white supremacy, they don't want the best and brightest if you're black or you're brown.
David, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I in a way second what Jerry's saying there. I think, it's not the capitalist class isn't the white supremacist. They're happy with Clarence Thomas and all these kind of people in there. But they're worried about the voting. It's democracy they're worried about because they see these minority groups and black groups and so on as being more likely to vote against them, So how do you mobilize these white people? I mean, you can't just say you got to support the rich. You got to say you got to support. You're in danger of losing your democracy. Notice they're never talking about suppressing the vote of the white working class. The voter suppression is targeted. And it's specifically targeted to make sure the Democrats lose and the Republicans win. Or the Democrats that will support them win, and so on. But, I think that's just another part of the strategy. You're always looking for ways in which because you're the minority, you're a big minority, and it's getting more and more obvious with the explosion of the billionaires and so on and so forth. You got to keep people divided. How do you do that? So we don't want to suppress democracy, not for the white workers. We're not going to take away their votes, for God's sake. It's those other votes we want to take away. And also it's striking that state legislatures are passing laws prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory in the classroom. I mean, what does that tell you? You're trying to fan the flames of that. Those are the people. Those liberals are out there, and so on and so forth. You got to keep the people divided. Play that race card, not because you care. I mean, black people, white people, they're all going to work for you. It doesn't matter to you. But, you got to have them, not a majority, because that's why you can't have democracy. You're not going to get a majority if you have democracy. You got to narrow it down to the point that only the people, high percent of the people who vote for you are allowed to vote. That's the point I see it.
Jerry had suggested a kind of neo-Keynesianism as the alternative. And if that were possible, that might very well restore enough legitimacy to the system so that the non-authoritarian methods would be able to prevail. Can you spell out a little bit what that neo-Keynesianism might look like and what its prospects are, short run or long run?
Well, I think the outlines are pretty clear in their legislation that they're putting forward, particularly the human infrastructure bill, which, has just all sorts of stuff in there from healthcare and education and reconstructing the social contract in many ways, not to where it was, but and I think they think that is the path to block the right populism. That's why they're doing it, that they have to appeal to the inequality and the austerity and the ripping up of the social contract and the deindustrialization that's happened. So what do they have in their toolbox but some type of reworked Keynesianism to reconstruct that? And the green accumulation strategy around that is the production of jobs. Where are the new jobs going to come from, and where are our profits going to come from in the future too? What's the next great historic round of technology? And that is in the green. That's part of the competitive with China too, which is leading in solar power and leading in the wind industry and leading in the battery industry and leading in the EV industry and all that also. So I think if you look at their legislation, even the pro-labor legislation that they're putting forward, the voting rights legislation, right? So bring minorities back into a Keynesian social bloc, bring the unions back into a Keynesian social bloc. And all that is necessary if they're going to build a majority and block the right populace.
And right now, all of that is hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, Harry?
Yeah, I just want to historicize and politicize a little bit. I would argue without much data, but I'm pretty much convinced that throughout American electoral history, that 25 to 30% of the American people voted in reactionary ways. I think the metaphor of the so-called Know-Nothing Party of the 1840s reflects this segment. In the period since the New Deal until Ronald Reagan was elected, a majority of voters voted Democratic. And there was maybe an 8-10 point spread between votes for Democrats and votes for Republicans. If you look at the late 70s, there was the beginning of economic delegitimization of Jimmy Carter, his speech about how we're all over consuming, and the enormous popularity of the actor Ronald Reagan, and Reagan's appeal to the white working class, Reagan's appeal to the religious right. So there are specific concrete reasons why there was a shift of maybe 10, 12% of the voters from the Republican camp to the Democratic camp. I would argue that the Clinton presidency gave legitimacy to Reagan's neoliberalism, and all of this had the effect of stimulating increased alienation among sectors of the American working class. So there are a lot of political reasons, it seems to me, why the shifts occurred. I've been reading through a number of books then that also involve descriptions of mobilization of the right, big money from the right. Nancy MacLean, Rick Perlstein's works on the Goldwater campaign and Nixon campaign. Ann Nelson has a book called Shadow Networks, and Jane Mayer. So this combination of small but significant money and growing disenchantment of sectors of the working class who traditionally vote Democratic have a lot to do with explaining where we are today. And the neo-Keynesian policies that Jerry talks about are vital, necessary, if not sufficient conditions to shift that 10 to 15% of the voters back in the Democratic column.
Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, has now been referenced several times in this discussion. And if there's anyone who is not familiar with it, I would highly recommend it.
I have a PowerPoint on it. I'll put in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, Al.
I guess I'll just throw out one other thing. Leave the other one, which just a big question for everybody to think about, including myself, and just throw out something else to think about. Jerry referred to a return to neo-Keynesianism, and I think that's actually very right. But I just want to caution that we should be very careful when we use that term, because we tend to think of it in terms of the 1950s when there was Keynesianism. And part of the 1950s was a social contract with the working class, never a class truce, of course, but a social contract of a certain type. You didn't go beyond them. 1959, when they smashed the electrical workers, they could have wiped them out, and they chose not to. what I want to point out is that when we use the word, we better be very careful, because neo-Keynesianism is so Jerry's right. I mean, that's a big part of it is, and one important part of it is the reestablishing some sort of social contract with a larger section of the working class, cutting across the alienation that Cliff and everybody's been talking about. But neo-Keynesianism is much more than that. And neo-Keynesian gives the government tools to intervene in the economy that free market ideology and free trade sort of stuff, Hillary Clinton's great theme for the 2016 elections, running on free trade. In particular, you can put in place capital controls, which we had in the 1950s. You can put in place trade barriers, all these things which we just don't even imagine anymore. They're all part of neo-Keynesian tools. And I will throw this out, and this will definitely be something that'll stir up some people. I would argue that reading people like Foreign Affairs and The Economist and something like that, who refers to China as authoritarian capitalist, and I don't want to get into whether China is capitalist or not. I'm carefully dancing around that issue. But in any case, whatever the hell they are, it's clear that the United States is in major competition with them in a way that it was never in competition with the Soviet Union, because China is building not only an equal technology network, which is going to be independent of the United States, so we can't strike them there, but it's also building a financial structure that's going to be independent of the United States. And that's already largely in place, and it'll be more in place within 5 years. So I would argue that the neoliberal free market ideology actually gives the government too few controls to compete effectively with China. And the United States is massively losing out to China in its competition with China, regardless of what the hell you think China is. Anyways, my point there is, when you think about the word neo-Keynesianism, which I totally agree with, just remember that there's other aspects than the fact that in the 1950s, the working class in the United States got treated better than it did under neoliberalism.
Yeah, what fascinated, when I was reading, I looked at these papers from the de-linkers and the decouplers, and that whole fact, and it was fascinating because it's really a very left view of China. And so, I mean, they view it as a communist country, and they're saying that they're actually using the market and using Western capitalism to develop China independently, and to build up their power and to build up their independence and to build up their military, and all these transnational capitalist corporations are either naive or they're complicit in it because they're investing in China, and therefore we need to use the state to stop these investments. It's interesting because their view of China very much supports sort of the view that China is, it has this very worked out socialist strategy of using globalization and using the markets to develop independent, economy. So the other thing, though, I think it will take China more time to build up an independent technological base. They are having these, alternate governance structures. They're loaning, out money. So a lot of global South countries are escaping IMF austerity. There's a lot of trade deals and alliances at China. So the financial thing is going ahead, and the road and the belt thing. But on technology, the semiconductor thing is a real problem for the Chinese. They are a number of generations back on that. And it's really very much of a global assembly around semiconductors. And the US has been pretty successful at this point of blocking Chinese access to, for example, some of the most sophisticated semiconductor machines that are made in the Netherlands that cost $150 million to buy these machines. They won't sell them to China at this point because of the United States have blocked it. And trying to block a Taiwanese semicomputer and South Korean semicomputer industries to China. So I think they're still, about 3 generations behind on the semiconductor technology. And that's going to be a little harder for them to catch up on than I think some of the other sort of governance and financial advances that they've been making globally.
So I'll just say on that for technology, we tend to think of technology as cutting edge technology, which is semiconductors and stuff like that. For a hell of a lot of the third world that would like to build infrastructure and housing and sanitations and stuff like that, there is the question. China builds the best trains in the world. China builds transportation networks. China, on and on, construction and so forth. And that means a lot to the majority of people in the world. So, I mean, your point is right. And that's very important. But The Economist, which is, not exactly ideologically in alignment with my view of the world, sees Chinese technology as challenging the United States now and much more over the next 3 to 4 years. And that's with what you say being true.
Yeah, that's why Biden went to the G7 and said they have to start investing in infrastructure in the global South, which they won't do. I mean,
there's no chance in hell.
No chance in hell. It's long-term investments with a 2 and 3% return. That's not what capital does. And that's why they haven't been doing it. So it won't happen. That was a shot in the dark. But yeah, that's a good point, Al. On the whole infrastructure technology and the high-speed rails and the dams and the roads and all that stuff they excel at. Yeah.
Well, this has been a rich discussion and could go on and on and on. And I would certainly love to see that. But let me call the attention to our YouTube viewers of a couple references that have been placed in the chat box, which of course they cannot see. Harry Targ posted a link to his blog spot that has lots of interesting material on it, including a piece on Nancy MacLean's book and democracy. And Carl Davidson posted a slideshow on Nancy MacLean's book, which is on his online University of the Left website. So you might want to consult those. Well, I think we need to end, and I want to thank you all for what has been a really excellent discussion, and one that I'm sure many will want to revisit because this webinar, as all of ours, will be available on YouTube, accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. I hope you'll join us again next week for our next webinar, which will feature a talk by Marcelo Vieta, When Workers Take Control. Marcelo has been a student of worker takeovers and worker ownership in Latin America, Argentina in particular, but in Europe and elsewhere as well. So I think he has a new book out on it. So I think you'll want to check that out next Monday, same time, same place, When Workers Take Control. Finally, thanks to our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and yours truly. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off.